Captain Greer and I were talking after our first interview from earlier today, and he said to me, and I quote, "I was just thinking about a long story I wish I'd been able to tell you. Nobody in your audience has ever heard a story like this. Mark Twain would have understood it completely. One subject it deals with is a species of humanity that is now extinct, one Mark Twain knew intimately and loved and admired. That would be the old professional mates we used to work with and learn from. Some of them were either steamboat mates or had learned from them. The world is poorer without them."
Indeed.
The other aspect of the story is bridges. One of the most difficult aspects of piloting is getting a tow as large as a 5-acre farm down between bridge piers of aged cement and steel as big as houses, with the current at your back. One of the most dangerous bridges on the lower Mississippi is the Vicksburg Bridge. The story concerns how to make that. Let me know if you want to do that story sometime. And I asked him, would you like to record right now? So that gets us to the current moment. Captain Greer, welcome back to the show. Please tell
Thank
me
you.
everything you can about
Okay.
steamboat.
One thing I neglected to tell you about my first trip is that just a few days after I had gotten on the boat, we were northbound below Vicksburg one morning about daylight, and I went out to check the tow by myself, and it was daylight by then, and we were under the bridge at that particular time, which was quite a sight. I've been across that bridge many, many, many times all my life, but I've never been underneath it. And a bridge looks a whole lot different from the underside than it does from the top side. But we got above the bridge, and I went about my watch work. I was upstairs in the pilot house, sweeping and mopping when we were up around Browns Point above Vicksburg. And the captain and I heard on the radio somebody announce that the towboat Lady Ree had hit the bridge. Somehow they had gotten out of shape in the bridge and hit one of the piers, and it literally cut that towboat in half. Several people were killed. I think they saved a couple of the crew members, but most of them went down with the boat, in about 70 feet of water. And that made a huge impression on me. I never forgot that. I never lost the sense that those bridges were dangerous. And of course, I've made them thousands of times since, without incident. But I never forgot that. Now, what makes it so difficult is the bridge is in a big turn, a sharp turn. It's very interesting. The river leaves the eastern wall of the Mississippi Valley at Memphis, and kind of sidles off to the west and makes a big loop around and creates not it creates the Mississippi Delta is what it creates, because from Memphis south the river seldom ran in one channel. It was not one river, it was probably two or three, and that's what created the Mississippi Delta. Well, it comes back to itself. It comes back to the Eastern Valley Wall at Vicksburg. And it's this long reach. It's almost as if it builds up steam as it comes back to that high bluff, at Vicksburg. And it makes a turn and then goes down into a very narrow place where the bridges are. You have the old Highway 80 bridge, and then they have the new I-20 bridge parallel down there. What makes it difficult is about middle of the river, above that turn, you have a sandbar. It's not a very high sandbar. In fact, I think during this recent low water, nobody saw any dry sand there, but it's there. You can see it nowadays on your charting system, and it splits the current. And it was always, that's what made it, sometimes it was better, probably the safest way to make that bridge was to float around there right on top of that sandbar, and let it, the current carry you around there and then push down through the bridge. That's the way you'd want to do with a really big tow. Otherwise, if you steer it, what's going to happen is you've got to push point at probably the second channel from the channel span, the second span. Just put your jack stab in it and try to run down through it, because you're going to be going sideways as fast as you are going forward, right? That's what makes dangerous about the bridge. So keep that in mind. I'll tell you, I was talking about these old mates I were, and they were remarkable people. I had one try to buy me one time. This was literally the most colorful human being I've ever known. His name was Boats Carpenter, and he had been a bosun mate in the Navy, and got out of the Navy during World War II. Got out of the Navy, went to work for Canal Barge Company, and spent the rest of his career there. And he was, oh Lord, he was a character. First of all, he had a voice like a bullhorn. He didn't need a loudhaler, a speaker, or a walkie-talkie. You could hear him from the head of the tow. And he had running lights tattooed on his ears. He had visited probably every tattoo artist in the Far East, and I think this was my second trip as a deckhand, and we had gotten aground. The old pilot, Captain Billy Clark, had waited at Sycamore Chute right there at Memphis for old Mace Tate. You don't know who these people are, but some of the people, old timers, will know who they are. Mace Tate worked for Federal Barge Line. He was captain of the America. We called him Big Daddy. He was a great big old fat man. One of my relief captains I worked with was good friends with Mace. And every time they'd meet, Mace would walk out on the bridge, suck his gut in, and his pants would fall to his ankles. And there were these polka dot drawers that looked like they may have been made by what's the Omar the tent maker, And he was a real character. But Captain Billy had waited for Mace to come across the crossing at Redmond Bar, and he'd settled in and got aground there. It was low water, and he couldn't get out. And it happened that another one of the company boats was coming up behind us down below Memphis, and they tied their tow off and came up to help us pull those barges off. And Boats was the mate. Well, I was following behind my mate, wouldn't let him touch a ratchet or a wire. I'd jump right in there and tighten it myself, and let him do the brain work. And I guess I was doing the right thing, and Boats liked what he saw, and he told my mate, who we call it, he had been a barge tender, and they called him Torch because he'd lit the bar. We called it. He said, "Say, Torch, I'll give you a brand new pike pole and a fresh painted steamboat ratchet for that boy right yonder." And I didn't know what to make of the old man, So what? And of course, Torch declined the offer, and Boat said, "Well, I can't go no higher than that." But that was my first acquaintance with boats. A few months later, I had been moved up to relief mate, and he was on another boat by that time, and we were pulling our tow off Hess Oil Dock in New Orleans, and he was putting his on, and we were both on the heads, parallel with one another with our walkie talkies. And Boats looked over at me, recognized me, looked over at me, looked me up and down, and said, "Yes, when they gonna make a goddamn captain out of you?" And of course, the next time I worked with Boats, I was a pilot, and he lived in Chickamauga, Georgia, and we were headed up the Tennessee River to load a tow at Knoxville. And they put Boats on with us. And coming out of that trip, Boats stood watch with me, and he'd have the other watchman do the work, and he would sit in the pilot house and tell stories, hold forth, and they were, oh, I wish I could have written them down. They were just marvelous, great stories. The only one I really remember is that he and his shipmates were in Macau, which is I think a Chinese island protectorate but where they speak Portuguese. I'm not sure, but they were there for a week or so. So he and his shipmates rented a house of ill repute. I mean, the whole house, a physical plant and employees for about a week. And he was telling me all about that. And what was fascinating about it was the name, Now, this is a lesson in translation and the complexities of translation, whether you're translating Koine Greek to Elizabethan English or Chinese to Portuguese to English and back again. But the name of the place was a house of 1,000 assholes. You know that something was not quite right there. Anyway, that was Boats. Boats was a character, and I loved working with him. I worked with several more of those old guys, and they knew so much. They'd been some of those guys. They couldn't read or write. One of them in particular, I remember, he had decked on steamboats during the 30s, and of course he had been an awfully hard time. He told me, if you got off a boat in those days, you didn't get days off. Said in those days, if you got off a boat, somebody else got your job, So they had it pretty rough, but they learned a lot. They knew skills that we've lost, things you can do with lines, and we did things with lines. We would take a line, and instead of use a tug, we might have a tug. We would flip a barge around the head of the tow and come back and bring it back up, just using a line to check it and everything. And people can't do that anymore. There's nobody who knows those skills, and we learned that from these old guys. But anyway, this is a story of Vicksburg Bridge, and it involves one of these old men. I am altering the tale to cover
To
for the
protect
innocent.
to
Yes,
protect the guilty.
to protect the guilty and the innocent. So this is one of those things where it's not, once upon a time. It's, no, this ain't no shit. It's one of these tales. But the old man's name was Daddio, and he was a real care. I don't know where he was from, but he lived in Natchez when he was mostly he lived on boats, But when he was at Natchez, he was one of about two or three other old men I knew back in those days who rented a room from Nellie Jackson. You know who Nellie Jackson? You ever heard of her?
I have
She
not.
ran one of the most notorious whorehouses on the Mississippi River in Natchez. And there's a documentary now about Miss Nellie. But and Nellie was she was mobbed up. So the girls that she brought in, they didn't stay very long. They moved off and a new batch came in, you know. But Nellie rented a couple of cottages out behind her house. And if Daddio was home, he would, you know, rent her one of those cottages. He'd make wine money by cleaning, you know, gravestones in the Natchez Cemetery. And he was not a good drunk. You know, you had to, if he got drunk, he probably wound up in jail. Fortunately, he didn't. He stayed on boats more than he stayed at home. But there was one time when they were headed for Houston, and they were going to load some kind of expensive chemical, and they needed somebody who really knew what they were doing, you know, in the tankerman business. And the old captain on that particular boat, he's the only captain that Daddio would ride with. They were old friends, you know. The old captain was as salty as the old mate. And one thing you need to know about this, as they say, is that old steamboat mates and captains, they they don't allow them. Of course, they don't allow them in heaven, but you know the devil won't have them in hell either. They send them back. They recycle them as white mules. So if you ever going up the river and you look over there and you see an old white mule, you know, raise his head and watch the boat go by, that's an old steamboat captain or a mate right there. And I can just imagine this particular old captain and Daddio as white mules. But uh, they rode together all the time. And this captain called and said, "I need Daddio. Put him on the boat. We'll come through Natchez." And the Marine superintendent, Daddio was in jail. You know, they had him in jail. I mean, I think he was arguing and fighting with the deputy sheriff there, and he said, "Hey, they're gonna come bail me out here, you know." And deputy said, "No, hell no, they're not. You're gonna be here 6 weeks, and you're gonna be chopping cotton at trots. What you're gonna be doing." And you know, they argued about that. Well, the Marine superintendent came to bail Daddio out, and of course, Daddio could not. He had to get the last word, and he told that deputy, he said, "I told you they were gonna come bail me out." And they opened the door, and instead of just leaving, Daddio just hauled off and knocked that deputy across the room, you know. Well, they wound up with Daddio and the Marine superintendent back in the jail cell. I think Daddio got fired for a while on that one, but he rode with this old captain all the time. That's the important thing. And one thing also about Daddio, the young pilots loved him. He was a you know unpleasant personality otherwise, but the young pilots loved him because he'd help them. A lot of these old captains, when they trained these guys, there were certain difficult skills that were too hard to train them for. They just couldn't bring themselves, for example, to let a steersman make a lock on the Ohio or the Illinois or wherever. And so they just said, "Well, you just got to figure that out when you start standing a watch." And Daddio would help them. If you listen to what Daddio told you to do, he'd keep you out of trouble. He would teach you how to make that lock. You know, he'd tell you, bring that head in, straighten it up. You know, you're starting to get set away from that wall. Better bring it back in. You know, that's important stuff because if you've got an outdraft on a lock wall, and you allow it to the head of that toe to get out, you know, 2 feet away from the wall. By the time you steer it back in, your rear end is going to be 4 feet or more away from the wall. and that's going to make you going in, and wedge yourself in if you're not careful. So those were important things. But the story that I wanted to tell you about Daddio is I was listening one night and overheard conversation of these two, this old captain and another old captain that had these were old men who were my father's age, they'd been doing it for a very long time. And they were both grouchy old so-and-sos, but they were talking, they'd known each other forever. And one was talking about, well, what's it doing down there at that bridge? Said, I see it's about 40 foot on the gauge. Said, and I hadn't been down here in a long time. One old captain said, well, it hadn't changed. There's nothing different about it. It's the same set in it. Said, you want to know how I make that bridge? I'll tell you. First thing I do is when I get to King, go by King's Point, I shape down that left descending shore. And about the time just before I get to that ragged revetment down there above the mouth of the Yazoo, I start steering up towards Delta Point. And that's when I send Daddio out on the head. That he doesn't want to go out there, but I send him out there anyway. And I tell him out there on that starboard head. And I tell him to, to watch me out there. And of course, I steer up on Delta Point, and you come off that point, you start getting that set a little bit, and I don't really start paying attention. I don't start watching Daddio until about a half a mile from the bridge. Then I watch him, and I watch him close. I have him out there on that starboard corner. And usually he's got that old foot up there on that timber head. And I can tell he's cussing me out up there. He won't be out there, but I watch him anyway. I need him out there. I tell him that. And he stands there and watches, for me. And I don't want him telling me how far I am. I can tell that, but all the time I'm falling sideways in that current. And I keep steering that jackstaff up on that right-hand pier. Keep steering it up there. And I keep watching Daddio. And you get about a toe length from that bridge. That's when that set really hits you hard. And that's when I don't let it go. I just keep it right up on that pier. I hold it right there. And I watch Daddio. I watch him close. And because the closer it gets, the more it gets, and he just knows, I can tell what he's thinking. He's thinking that so-and-so is going to hit this bridge and it's going to crush me like a bug, Of course, you can't hit that bridge, but I'm watching him anyway, and he's kind of walking up and down, back and forth and watching that pier. And I keep getting closer, and you get kind of down on that bridge, and that pier will disappear. You won't be able to see it over your toe. And I keep steering that jackstaff up on that pier like I'm gonna run over it. But I watch Daddio. Now, when Daddio breaks and runs, I put it on straight rudder, and it falls right in there every time. You have to imagine a Daddio out there getting close enough to that bridge that he's going to break and run, or you have to imagine Daddio breaking and running from anything.
Any other good stories come to mind with
not immediately, but anybody who does that for a living will get a kick out of that story, because they know Daddio, and they know that bridge too. How awful that thing looks trying to make it. And they can just imagine him sending that poor old man out there and making him watch that bridge pier coming at him. Because you got to try to run over it, to keep, or the pier, between those piers, you don't have much room. You have something like, I don't know, maybe 800 feet. I'm not sure, but your toe is 1,200 feet long at best, at most. Maybe a little longer with some of those super toes. But and if you're sideways in that bridge, I've seen people hit that bridge. It can be hit. It can be hit on either side. But that's kind of to me, that story really testifies to the character of some of those old men and some of those old mates.
Absolutely. I have one more question for you now. You got a few minutes?
Sure.
What do you think of chief engineers from the mid 70s and today?
Well, the big error that I think that the industry made is they have all of these monitors, that where they they don't have an engineer in the engine room. They had a monitor system. The engineer sleeps in a bedroom next to the monitor system, but if something happens, he's got to get up in the middle of the night and go see what it is. And I've never been comfortable with that. And also, that has, I think, interfered with training these engineers. You've got to know a lot more. It's harder to train an engineer than it is to train a pilot. An engineer actually has to know something. and, these engines are complex machines. I remember one old man we were on an old boat that had Nordbergs. If you've never ever heard of Nordberg machines, I think they're Scandinavian, came from some Scandinavian country. They were good. They're good engines, but like he said, there's just spelling Nordberg's hard work. Much less working on them. And it's I've had engineers who, you know, if you in the middle of the night when he's trying to, when the lights are out, if the day tank ran out or something, and he's got to fill that back up, and there you are floating down the river, in the dark, nothing works, and you better have a good engineer. You really better have a good engineer. And I think it's hurt them in the long run. In not they don't have as many engineers as they now need. You know, and I think they're probably doing a better job of training them. They're they do like automobile companies. They send them to classes, teach them how to work on machines and everything, and keep them up on new. But that's still not, that may or may not help you in the middle of the night, when the alarms are going off and the lights go out. So that's my reservation about that. I'm sure it saves these companies a whole lot of money, but I also know of some boats that have, burned up because they couldn't catch whatever it was fast enough, and that happens so quickly. When you get an engine blow up on you, or catch fire, or something, you can get a bunch of people killed, and it's just dangerous out there floating around in the river with your boat on fire. I mean, I've seen that happen. Never been on a boat when something like that happened, but knock on wood. But uh, but yeah, I understand the companies, these corporations, their perspective on it, that it does save them a lot of money. But I've never been convinced of the that these monitoring systems were sufficient to real safety. I don't think they are.
But what about the importance of a good cook on board?
Cook makes it. Yeah, it's really important. A bunch of us actually retired over at ACBL when some guy, vice president of operations, decided to get rid of the cooks. We all left, you know, because especially on the lower Mississippi, nobody's got time to cook. Now I've tripped. For Kirby, where they have a small crew, they have small tows, but somebody will cook usually the chief engineer. It's not the best diet in the world, but a good cook makes a huge difference in your enjoyment. I mean, it's all you've got to look forward to, really. Is a good meal and and rest. And otherwise, it's all work for most people. So I've always thought it was really, really important. Now you get a bad cook and you're better off without one at all. I've worked with a lot of those too.
Anything else coming to mind you want to touch on before we call this one?
No, I can't think of anything else. I've thought about that tale that I wish I'd told, but other than that, no, I guess not.
If you come up with anything else, let me know. We can always do this again.
Okay, I sure will. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Cap.
This has been a production of Where You At Studios, LLC.